Hello and welcome everyone. Bonjour à tous. My name is Francine Pelletier and I will be your host this afternoon and very happy to be here too for this live and interactive telephone town hall discussion with NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh. This is the first installment of the 2019 Leaders Series hosted by Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. You'll be hearing more about that in a moment. Pour les francophones parmi vous, l'événement cet après-midi se déroulera en anglais, mais vous pouvez poser vos questions en français et M. Singh, le cas échéant, vous répondra en français. Right now, we are calling thousands of Friends supporters right across Canada. It will take a few minutes to connect with everyone. So as we are dialing, let me take a moment to explain how a telephone town hall works. This kind of town hall enables us to reach out and talk with thousands of people from the comfort of their homes. And it allows you to connect directly with party leaders like Jagmeet Singh to ask questions live on air and get an immediate answer. If you would like to ask Mr. Singh a question, this is what you have to do. You need to press *3, star and number 3 on your phone. Si vous voulez poser une question à M. Singh, il faut peser l'étoile et le numéro 3 sur votre téléphone. For those of us just joining the call, this is a telephone town hall with NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh, the first installment. This is a first in a series, a leader series hosted by Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. As we wait for everyone to join, I would like to welcome Daniel Bernhard, Executive Director of Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, to say a little more about the Leaders Series and the reason we are all here today. Bonjour, Daniel.
Thank you, Francine, and hello to everyone on the call and those who are joining us just now. I'm really glad that you're able to join me on this telephone town hall, the first installment of our 2019 Leaders Series. As we did in 2015, Friends has invited all the major party leaders to speak directly with our supporters about CBC, journalism, democracy, Canadian content, and other related issues. So far, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh and Green Party leader Elizabeth May have confirmed their participation. Liberal leader Justin Trudeau and Conservative leader Andrew Scheer have not yet responded to our invitation, but I do hope they will soon. I know that everyone is itching to get to Jagmeet Singh. Just a reminder, if you do have a question for Mr. Singh, you can ask it live by pressing *3 on your phone. Now, while we wait for more people to be connected to this call, I'd like to say a couple words about Friends' priorities for this election campaign. Canadian journalism is in deep trouble. There's no other way to say it than that. In the past decade, 16,000 journalists have been laid off. 250 media outlets have closed, and at the same time, CBC remains among the most poorly funded public broadcasters in the developed world. It is hardly equipped to pick up the slack. When journalism suffers, so does democracy. It should therefore come as little surprise that Canada's #1 news source is now Facebook, and yes, you are right to be terrified. The problem is, Facebook has absolutely no legal obligation to tell the truth, unlike Canadian media. They spread hate and propaganda with total impunity, not to mention that they pay no taxes here. And while they are siphoning billions of dollars of advertising revenue away from Canadian media, they do not employ a single journalist here in Canada. To make matters worse, Ottawa actually subsidizes the likes of Facebook and Google with $1.6 billion of our tax dollars every year thanks to a loophole in the Income Tax Act. So, Friends supporters across the country are telling all of their candidates from all parties that we expect and we deserve better. It's time to end big tech's free ride in Canada. It's time to end subsidies for U.S. tech corporations like Facebook that are poisoning our democracy. It's time to level the playing field for quality Canadian journalism that sustains our democracy. And most important, it's time to restore CBC's news budget, especially for local services. Friends supporters across Canada have been putting up lawn signs. They've been telling their politicians that we choose Canada, and if you want our vote, you should too. So if you'd like to learn more about our campaign, I encourage you to visit our campaign website at wechoose.ca. Be sure to sign the petition while you're there. Et pour les francophones, je viens d'exprimer les enjeux principaux de notre campagne électorale. Rendez-nous visite chez anousdechoisir.ca pour en apprendre plus de nos priorités. Et n'oubliez pas de signer la pétition. Alors, c'est à vous, Francine. Merci.
Merci, Daniel. Thank you. And now, for those of you who are just joining us now on the call, we are here today for a special telephone town hall discussion with NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh. This afternoon, you'll get a chance to ask Mr. Singh your questions about CBC, Canadian journalism, and Canadian democracy, and you can share your thoughts through real-time, interactive quick polls. Here's how to ask your question. If you are on the phone, press star 3, star and number 3. An operator will take down your question and put you in line so that you can ask your question to Mr. Singh directly. For those of you joining online, please type your question into the message box. I can see that there are thousands of people joining on the line and still more to come. So before we officially begin, I will take this opportunity to ask my own question to Mr. Singh, who, first of all, I welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for accepting this invitation. Mr. Singh, there has been much debate in Canada about what to do about Netflix, Google, Facebook, and other giant corporations on the web who right now, as Daniel pointed out, pay nothing to have access to the Canadian market. Your platform, the NDP platform, says that these digital media companies should play by the same rules as Canadian broadcasters. What exactly do you mean by playing by the same rules? How do you mean to go about this?
Merci beaucoup, Francine. Thank you so much for the question. And hi to everybody that's joining the call. Thanks for being with us on this lovely Sunday afternoon. Or it depends on where you are, actually, if it's that time. But I want to say that, Francine, you brought up a really important question. The situation as it is right now means that if you're a web giant, you are getting a massive advantage. And that massive advantage is hurting Canadians. And that's something we want to stop. So Daniel brought it up before. There is a massive tax loophole that advantages web giants, companies like Netflix, Facebook, Google. They have a massive advantage, an incentive that gives them a disproportionate advantage over Canadian broadcasters or Canadian content creators. Our own stories are so powerful and so important, and we should be able to tell our own stories. But we don't have the ability to tell our own stories because the governments in Ottawa, both conservative and liberal, have designed a system that disadvantages our own storytellers, our own journalists, our own culture and media here in Canada, and have advantaged those that don't actually want to tell Canadian stories or don't care about making sure they're telling the truth. And that is a serious issue. So what we're going to do is, one, close the loopholes and make sure that there's no unlevel playing field. Make sure that web giants are paying their fair share. End the loophole where they're not paying taxes, and end the tax loophole, which means that a company gets a tax advantage if they advertise through one of these web giants instead of spending money in their local institution. Our goal is to have a vibrant media culture, which includes arts, culture, and journalism. We want Canadians to know they can trust the information they're getting, so we want to make sure that we have in place checks and balances that assure that Facebook isn't allowed to spread information that's not true. Then we want to make sure that they're able to be held accountable if there is hateful and divisive messages, and that those messages are taken off. There needs to be accountability. There needs to be a level playing field. We need to protect our Canadian content and culture and ensure there's a thriving journalism. And we can do that if we make the right choices, and we're prepared to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. For those of us just joining, welcome to the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting telephone town hall with NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh. If you have a question for Mr. Singh this afternoon, just press star 3 on your phone at any point during the call. An operator will take down your question and put you in line to ask your question. Vous pouvez poser vos questions à M. Singh en appuyant étoile, ensuite le numéro 3. Si vous posez la question en français, M. Singh vous répondra en français. I think we are ready to take our first online question, but first, let's start with a quick poll. That is a question to you, our audience. Our first poll question is, which of the following issues concerns you most? Press 1 for CBC funding. Press 2 for the crisis of truth and journalism. Press 3 for hate speech online. Press 4 for fake news and the election, and press 5 for Canadian content on screen. Let me repeat that. Which of the following issues concerns you most? 1, CBC funding. 2, the crisis of truth and journalism. 3, hate speech online. 4, fake news in the election. Or 5, Canadian content on screen. Thanks for letting us know what you think. We'll report back on the results in a few minutes, and we will now begin our questions from the audience. Our first online question is from Harold. Harold would like to ask, does the NDP commit to closing the internet advertising tax loophole? Mr. Singh.
Harold, thank you so much for the question. Yes, very much so, yes. We think it's completely unfair that there is a loophole that allows essentially a massive advantage to be given to advertising with the web giants, with the social media platforms. That to me makes no sense, and it disadvantages Canadian media. There's a reason why we're in the position that Canadian journalism is on the decline, but there's a massive increase in profit for online media platforms. It's because they've been given an advantage. Effectively, Mr. Trudeau and the Liberal government have been subsidizing the digital platforms, and digital platforms that are international, foreign digital platforms. That is wrong. We would end that immediately. We have the courage to stand up to these web giants. We're not going to cave into their demands like Mr. Trudeau and the Conservatives have. We are going to say that we need a level playing field, and that the rules that apply to Canadian journalism and media and broadcasting should apply to international. If anything, we should encourage supporting local Canadian media and content as opposed to international. But we first take the first step by stopping the tax loophole, which is so unfair.
Ask their question. Thank you, Mr. Singh. There are a lot of people now waiting to ask a question. Just a reminder of what you must do if you are on the phone to ask a question to NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh. If you press *3 on your phone to get in line, and an operator will take down your question and put you in line to ask your question live. Vous pouvez poser des questions en français. Appuyez simplement sur étoile et le numéro 3. Our first question comes from Nora in Winnipeg, and her topic is CBC funding. Nora, what is your question exactly?
I would like to see a more representative system. I want my vote to count, and I feel that this first past the post, my voice gets lost. And also, I'm happy to hear support for more local funding for the CBC, and I'd like to see more programs like Still Standing. I would like to see, because I'm in Winnipeg, I'd like to see weather not come just from Toronto or Calgary, but to come from Winnipeg, and more local information. But I applaud the steps that you're taking on making the truth of misinformation and helping us with the general public with that.
So, Nora, is your question about local news? Do you want to? What is your question exactly?
Well, I think that's going to be covered. So I think I want to know if the NDP would bring in a more representative government, so our votes count. So all these things that we want to see, that our votes would count, rather than the first past the post system.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I can tell you yes, absolutely. I believe in proportional representation, and I would bring that in, and it's a part of my commitments. But your questions around local content, you talked about weather from Winnipeg and not getting it from Calgary or from Toronto. I absolutely believe that this is what we need to do. You're absolutely right. Like you're in Winnipeg and you want to hear local content. You want to hear local shows that tell the story of what's happening in Winnipeg, the weather, but also the story in the news. And you want funding for CBC. I absolutely agree with that. There's been massive cuts to CBC, and we need to end that. We need to, instead of those cuts, we need to fund CBC so that we can have good local content, our own stories, our Canadian stories being told. And misinformation is a big issue, and that's why we need to support local Canadian journalism by making sure that the laws that are applied apply not to advantage the foreign companies like Facebook and Google, but they're applied to benefit local Canadian content. So I'm there with you all the way, Nora, and we're absolutely going to make sure we put in place better protections and supports for CBC and local Canadian journalism and the ability to tell the stories that you want to hear about, the stories from your community.
Thank you. Let's go straight to our second question from Judith in Yellowknife. Her topic is ads on the CBC. Judith, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, I'm disturbed by the fact that I don't see good ads from all of the party leaders. I feel that CBC should be representing every party leader equally. I don't think there should be a smear campaign. I watch CBC Sports. I watch CBC News. It is the only news that I actually watch. Yesterday, I saw at least 4 smear campaign ads, the same ad against Justin Trudeau, and I think that's wrong. And I think, Mr. Singh, I think that your party should be presenting your policies. I have voted NDP in the past as I have voted Liberal. And I want to know the policies. I don't want to hear anybody slamming you or slamming Justin Trudeau or even slamming the party leaders that I'm not that supportive of. I think it's wrong. I don't believe that's how Canada should be.
Judith, I have to ask you to ask a question. Could you ask a question, please? I lost her. Mr. Singh, would you like to answer Judith?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Judith, for the question. I hope you're still listening. I want to say that I really appreciate your concern about making sure everyone has a chance to share their position with you, all the parties. I think that's really fair of you. And I think a lot of Canadians would agree with you that they want to make sure that people know where each party stands on which position, on which issue, and they want to be able to make a decision that way. I think that's something that I'd love to see happen as well. Right now with our current system, it's often based on fundraising and who can fundraise more, but there's got to be a better way for us to share our positions and our values and what we do in a way that you would be able to see them all equally. So I appreciate the sentiment, Judith. I can tell you that I believe in making sure that we've got a healthy democracy where we have good debates and can show the differences of where we stand, but we can do it in a way that's respectful, in a way that actually helps you make a better decision.
And now a question from Ron in Edmonton. He has a question concerning the CBC versus the BBC. Ron.
Yeah, I was just wondering, it's probably too late, I suppose. I would be in favor of a tax like they have in Britain for the BBC, and I just wish we had instituted it earlier when perhaps it would have been easier to pass, because I think the CBC does such a great job, but of course not everybody in the country believes that. So I was just wondering if you would support a push to have some kind of tax-based. Well, there is, of course, CBC gets money from tax money, but if it was perhaps more generous towards CBC or earmarked more directly for the CBC. Anyway, just wondering where you stand on that.
Thank you so much, Ron. You're absolutely right. You mentioned BBC, and the funding in terms of Canada versus other jurisdictions, we actually have some of the lowest funding per capita of our public broadcasting, and it's something we've got to change. If we look at some countries, just for example, BBC spends about $100 per person. Norway says $162 per person. So we can do a lot better. What we're proposing to do is let's do an increase right away. Let's move from $34 per person to $50. We want to get Canada to a level where we're funding our public broadcasting. We know that the Liberals funding, that small increase that they have proposed, won't really adjust for inflation and for declining revenue. The Conservatives massively cut the funding, and that's wrong. It's been an ongoing trend, whether we're talking about the Chrétien government or the Martin government. Liberals and Conservatives have been cutting the funding for our public broadcasting, and it hurts Canada when we don't have the means to tell our stories and to be able to provide information to Canadians. So I absolutely believe we should make that choice. And in terms of how we can pay for it, it's really a matter of priorities. We've seen that Mr. Trudeau and other governments, conservative, give massive tax cuts, basically give billions of dollars to wealthy corporations. Those are decisions we wouldn't make. Instead, we would make decisions to invest in people. Now, those are services, but those include also public broadcasting.
I'm going to jump in there, Mr. Singh, because that was one of my questions about CBC funding. So can I get you on the record? You'd hike the funding from $34 per person to $50 per person. An NDP government would do that?
That's correct. We believe that it's important to increase that funding. We've seen massive cuts over the years, and it's hurt people. We heard from Nora, who says that she's not getting weather anymore from Winnipeg. We know that people really care. Judith mentioned that that's her primary source of hearing news. We know that Ron cares a lot about it. So I believe absolutely Canadians expect us to fund our public broadcasting, and we are committed to doing that.
Now let me read you a question, an online question from Helen in London. This is a question from Helen in London. Mr. Singh, will you audition to replace Rick Mercer? I think it's a real question.
That is an awesome question. I had a really good time with Rick Mercer when we did the show together. I don't know if you remember, but we threw some axes together and we biked on. I had him in my cargo bike. It was a lot of fun. I would love to do the show, but right now I'm auditioning for another job. I want to become the Prime Minister. So I am going to work on this audition first. It's an important job, and I think we can make a big difference in people's lives. And maybe in my political retirement down the road, I'll consider taking over a show like that. Thank you so much for the question.
Before we go to more questions, let me look at the poll results. The poll results of our first question. The first question was, which of the following issues concerns you most? 1, CBC funding. 2, the crisis of truth and journalism. 3, hate speech online. 4, fake news and the election. Or 5, Canadian content on screen. The results are 41% CBC funding, which the major concern for Canadians that we are hearing from today is CBC funding, 41%, followed by the crisis of truth and journalism, 27%. Believe that's the major concern. Hate speech online follows with 11%. Fake news in the election follows with 14%. Then hate speech online and Canadian content on screen, 7%. Your reaction, Mr. Singh?
Well, I know that Friends of Canadian Broadcasting really care a lot about CBC funding, so I am not surprised that was a priority. But it's good to see, I'm encouraged to see people are worried about truth and journalism because it's a legitimate concern. There's a lot of fake news out there, and fake news has pretty devastating impacts. It can shape decision-making, and when decisions are made based on lies or things that are not true, it really erodes our democracy. So the fact that people are concerned about it is reassuring because having the support of people to tackle this is going to be crucial, and we can do this. If we made it a priority, we could ensure that online media had to have more accountability. We can also ensure, another way to ensure that we support journalism is to make sure that there's information that is used by social media they have to pay for it. So we know that journalists often write stories and do the work, and then a web giant can just take the story and then post it on their page without ever compensating the journalists who put in the work. And that, to me, is another reason why journalism is on the decline. There's not proper remuneration for the work that they're doing. They're not being paid for their work. And so it's good to see. The other concerns around fake news and the election is a specific concern, and it kind of ties into the crisis of truth in journalism. So those are very linked. And the rest are very important issues. We need to deal with hate speech online. It's a concern that's growing, and Canadian content. I'd love to see more Canadian content, so we're telling our stories better.
Well, most of these results, the ones you're mentioning, point a finger to Facebook, essentially. I mean, Facebook is where Canadians get most of their news. It's the number one network or news provider for most Canadians. What are we going to do about Facebook?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's become one of the biggest sources for news, but they don't employ a single journalist. And there's no accountability in terms of if they do post fake news, there's no way to hold them account, and there's no repercussions if they post fake news or if they allow it to be spread. We know that very recently when Facebook founder testified in front of Congress, a lot of questions were raised around what the impacts are of Facebook on our democracy. I think more than ever we need to have the courage to say, there's a social benefit for people being able to use social media to connect, but there's a massive problem that's been left untouched or unsolved, and it can absolutely be dealt with if we have the courage to do so, and we're committed to it. So we believe, one, let's put in place national accountability measures to make sure that fake news is not being spread, that there's accountability when there's news that's not accurate that's being spread, that we have a requirement that information posted on Facebook has to be, when it's taken from journalists, there's compensation so that we can encourage journalism to thrive. There's so much that we can do, and really it's about having the conviction to take a step.
Thank you. We will be taking some more questions. Our next question is from Sandra in Victoria about fake news. Your question, Sandra.
Yes, good afternoon. My question is, how do we expose, or how do we understand that there is a possibility, this was exposed by investigative journalists, that the concept that there's no longer a space to hold a true democratic election in our country because of those with very deep pockets who can buy third-party advertisement. And we witness this worldwide when we question, how did this person ever get in power? So how do we reclaim our own country and not allow this to happen where they buy their puppet who represents their own interests? And that has been bothering me because, I do research a lot of the fake news, and I know pictures are doctored, but just the idea that we no longer have a true democracy really frightens me. Thank you.
Mr. Singh.
Sandra, thank you so much for the question. You're absolutely speaking to the heart of the matter. When we think about fake news, sometimes we think about it being innocuous, not a big deal. There might be just some misinformation being spread, and what's really the big deal about that? Well, you've touched it. If there's fake news or information that's misinformation that's being spread, and particularly if a third party is spreading it, it could directly impact the decisions people make in our democracy. And in effect, it would really erode our democracy. You're right to be afraid, because how can we have a real choice in an election where people are voting based on the issues they believe in if they're making that decision based on information that's not true? It is very scary. But there's hope, though, that, Sandra, it doesn't have to be this way. We can do things very differently, and that's what I'm proposing. We can hold the web giants to account. we can make sure we end some of the loopholes that allow them to continue to prosper, to do so well, and we can make better choices to ensure that democracy is strong. On the example of fake information, I also was a victim of that. In a by-election, there was fake news that I owned a mansion, and they said that Mr. Singh owns this mansion, and it turned out the picture was from a home in California, and it had nothing to do with me. It was just a random house that they said it was a home that I lived in. But really, what it comes down to is, do we have a government in Ottawa that's willing to make sure you, Sandra, can rely on the information that's being spread around, that you can have confidence in the information that people are making decisions on? Or will we have a government in Ottawa that continues to basically be afraid to take on the big web giants and be afraid to call it out and to hold them to account? For the past number of years, Sandra, your fear has been coming to light because Mr. Trudeau and before him Mr. Harper haven't had the courage to take on this really serious issue. I can assure you that it matters to me, and I'm going to take it on.
Well, I'm going to push you on that, Mr. Singh, because that is a question that's sort of a big question I think many Canadians have. Why is it that not only the Conservatives but the Liberals have been so despondent in terms of asking the web giants to be responsible, to level the playing field for all the broadcasters, be they foreign or national? Why are we taking so long about this?
Well, I was wondering the same question myself. I was wondering, why is this the case? It seems to be really obvious. We could solve this. We would gain more revenue if we put in place a fair taxation system. We mentioned that there's effectively a $1.6 billion subsidy of web giants like Facebook and Google. Why is it that it's not being addressed? We could gain revenue. We could use that to invest in Canadian content and Canadian journalism. The big question is why? Why is it that Liberals and Conservatives were doing this? Well, one of the reasons is we looked at the trends of lobbying. We found that the tech giants, their lobbying has quadrupled over the past short number of years. And it shows that they're having far too much influence over decisions. We see a lot of the senior staff in the Liberal government coming directly from some of the tech giants and the web giants. So they are too closely influenced and connected to these powerful groups, and they are not prepared to make decisions that would actually make things fair for Canadians. They're continuing the status quo, which is to allow these big tech giants to have massive advantages, and that hurts Canada and it hurts Canadians. And so that's why I'm going to change that with your help and with the help of the good folks on this phone call who care about these issues. We are going to change the direction of our country.
But the French, the English, the Spanish, I think even in India, they've pushed back against the web giants. They're putting in rules. I mean, they've been lobbied too, those countries, by Facebook and company. Why are the Canadians so timid about this again?
I mean, not to be too partisan, but the two governments that have been in power have been Conservative and Liberal. I think it's time we give another government a shot, and we would get this done. You're absolutely right. Not only the countries you named, but across Europe, there's been a very strong series of steps taken to ensure that there's more fairness, it's more equitable, and it's helped out local journalists and local media. I believe we can do that here in Canada. It's really just a matter of choices. It's not something that's insurmountable. It's not impossible. It's just a question of will someone do it. I can assure everyone listening to this call, New Democrats believe in this. We think this is a serious erosion of our democracy, and if we make the right choices now, we can actually build up a stronger journalism in Canada, a stronger storytelling of Canadian content. We can do so much if we make the right choices.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. We now have a question from Denise en français, Denise à Sainte-Catherine de Hatley. Et son sujet, c'est par rapport au contenu canadien. Madame Denise, voulez-vous poser votre question?
Mr. Singh, I can speak English too. I live in the Eastern Townships, and we don't, in my county, we don't have any NDP representing us. We had one but he lost the last time. So I was wondering, will you cover the whole country, or are there going to be holes in the country? And I have j'ai une autre question. Je vis près des États-Unis et j'écoute M. Trump et je trouve qu'il est parfois, souvent même, l'auteur des fake news. Est-ce que vous allez avoir le gumption de vous tenir debout devant M. Trump?
Bonne question. Merci Singh. À vous.
Des belles questions. Merci beaucoup, Denise. Merci beaucoup. Aussi, j'ai visité les cantons Est. Ils sont tellement jolis. Donc, vous êtes tellement chanceuse d'habiter dans une région aussi beau que la vôtre. Donc, commençons en parlant des candidats et candidates. Oui, avec grande fierté, on va avoir des candidats et candidates dans chaque comté à travers le pays. Donc, vous pouvez vous assurer qu'on va avoir un candidat ou une candidate dans votre comté. Et pour l'NPD, je peux vous assurer comme chef que pour moi, c'est une priorité d'avoir une présence forte de les médias, le contenu canadien, le contenu québécois. C'est tellement important pour moi de promouvoir les journalistes au Canada. Et les fausses nouvelles, c'est un grand enjeu. Vous avez raison que M. Trump lui-même promouvoit la fausse information. Donc, oui, je peux dire oui fermement, je peux et je vais me tenir debout à M. Trump parce que il est quelqu'un qui est vraiment une menace pour la démocratie et il faut le dire, il faut dénoncer ses gestes parce que ça a eu un impact au Canada aussi. Donc, avec beaucoup de fierté, je peux dire oui, je veux me tenir debout au M. Trump, mais aussi je vais continuer de promouvoir le contenu canadien, le contenu québécois.
We are approaching, we've actually passed the midway point of our telephone town hall. We have lots more time for more questions. I'll just remind you, if you would like to ask a question to Mr. Singh, please press *3 on your phone and get in line to ask your question. An operator will take down your question and you will be able to ask your question directly. And I would also like to remind people that you will get a chance to, if you do not get a chance to ask your questions live this afternoon, you will be able to leave a message for Mr. Singh at the end of our telephone town hall. So to get back to our questions, we now have a question from Esther in Victoria. Her topic is about the CBC and social media. Esther, your question, please.
Oh, good afternoon, and thank you so much. I don't use much social media, but I can see that it is the trend with media, not just contact between people. And considering that the CBC has responded creatively over the past decades, and especially the past number of years, to public interests, and I point to, for example, the Indigenous content that's now on the CBC that I truly appreciate. I'm wondering how the CBC might be able to respond, not just with proposals to the government regarding tax loopholes and funding, et cetera, but also in terms of their own content. How can they respond to this trend in media, please? And thank you very much.
Esther, thank you so much. I really appreciate your question because it touches on a couple of things. One, I agree with you. There's some great steps that CBC is taking with respect to content, Indigenous content. I'm sure we can do a lot more, but those are positive signs. But you're right, there is a trend, a really clear trend where more and more people are getting their information from social media. It seems to be the trend. So it would be a good idea for CBC to kind of be prepared for that trend and to ensure that they've got content that's available on those different platforms so that people who are making that shift or that trend as it grows, there's still great Canadian content on those platforms. But what I talked about before, one of the reasons why those social media platforms are growing is because they've been given a massive advantage. And that massive advantage is unfair. So they've been given, effectively, because of the tax loopholes, it's like the Canadian government has been giving billions of dollars to social media. And that's part of why they're growing so fast. So it's not by chance. The trend has been fueled by decisions, by policies. And I believe what we should be doing with our public dollars is investing in Canadian content, making sure that there's Canadian journalists and actors and storytellers and musicians and artists telling Canadian stories. And that's why I wholeheartedly believe in ending the inequality, that subsidy effectively that the government's giving to Google and Facebook and to other social media platforms, and we reinvest that into building a stronger climate for media and for Canadian storytelling. That is a very important step that we can take. And I can tell you that in Victoria, Laurel Collins is our candidate there, and she's going to fight hard to support all the initiatives that we can to invest in Canadian content. And I want to thank you again, Esther. And Victoria, where you live, is a really beautiful place. I look forward to being there probably in about a week. So maybe I'll see you at an event.
I'd like to ask you a little more about Canadian content because I know that's another pressing concern for many organizations, media organizations, and Canadians. I know that the rule right now obliges Canadian broadcasters to give 30% of their revenue to Canadian content. Would an NDP government oblige the foreign broadcasters, media companies, to do the same?
Great question. Right when you wrote the question, the first thing I wrote down was Netflix, because this is an example of a massive failure. So to your point, Canadian broadcasts have to invest 30% into Canadian content. Now, Netflix didn't follow the rule, and then they struck an agreement, basically a secret deal behind closed doors with Melanie Joly. And they promised an investment, which was nowhere near 30%. And now, after a number of years passed after this commitment, we haven't seen any results of any investments. So I absolutely believe what we need to do is make sure the same rules that apply to a Canadian broadcaster or a Canadian media outlet have to be the same rules that apply to an international outlet. And if we can't get those, well, we have to. We have the power, we have the ability to do so. We can't allow the injustice to continue, the unfairness to continue. So what we're going to do is, yes, absolutely require any international platform to follow the same rules that Canadian broadcasters have to follow to ensure that they're contributing back into Canada. And this is a rule. This is an idea that has worked in other countries, that has been implemented. We can do it here in Canada as well, and I'm committed to that.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Now for our second poll question. The question we would like you to answer is the following. Should the government apply the same laws and rules to internet media companies like Facebook and Netflix as their Canadian competitors? Again, the question is, should the government apply the same laws and rules to internet media companies like Facebook and Netflix as their Canadian competitors? Yes or no? Please take a moment to answer the question for us. In the interim, we are going to another question. This one is from Joy in Victoria again, and she would like to know about the NDP reform, about the CBC, what the NDP reform, what the NDP has in store for the board of directors of the CBC. Joy, perhaps you would like to ask that question directly.
Okay. Yes, under Stephen Harper, the last thing he did before going out of power was to install choice people of his to the board of the CBC. From my perspective, that's like a partisan placement, and so I'm wondering if there will be any looking at restructuring, looking at the board just to make sure that policies, whatever, with the CBC aren't being influenced by conservative interests. And one other thing before you answer that, I have been so upset all week because with the blackface, and if anyone looked at history, that is not a Canadian thing. That has come up from the States. I'm 68 years old. I've lived all across Canada. And that and I have a lot of friends who are black, and we would go to parties, and I would put makeup on because we were trying to be similar. And I keep thinking, you look at the context of what he did, and here it's taking up all the news, and I want to hear from people about issues. And it just makes, I've voted NDP before, but even you have been playing into it, and it just...
And the question is about this?
About the board. Well, there's two questions. But, will he put a stop to this garbage that is going on with the smear campaigns?
And the second question? Okay, we'll start with the first question.
So we have a question on a topic, and I just have to say, Joy, I think that you might be mistaken in terms of your understanding of history in Canada. There is a tradition of blackface in Canada that's been well documented. It was really harmful to people. It suggested that people's lives were not important, that their lives were made fun of, that their experiences were made fun of, and so that's a pretty big deal. And when people make light of someone's reality, it may not have been in someone's intention, but that's the impact of it, and it hurts a lot of people. A lot of people feel like that maybe their realities don't matter, or what they're going through doesn't matter. I don't really think it's about Mr. Trudeau specifically. I think it's about what that says about what people are going through and what they're faced with. And I think it's something we've got to think about. And I met with a lot of young people who were hurt by it, and I think that's important to focus on the people that are hurt and how we can remedy that. To your question about CBC directors, I think that the directors and the board should reflect Canada and should reflect the needs of Canada, and they shouldn't be biased towards a particular party. They should be focused on making sure Canadians get fair and unbiased information and news of the highest journalistic standards, and that we're focusing on making sure we tell the stories that reflect the country we live in, and those are the stories that should be given emphasis and importance. And I think you're absolutely right to worry about people being chosen not for whether that criteria is very clear. We need to make sure that our criteria is always clear in our public institutions, that their mandate is to fulfill the public good and not to advance a particular party's interests. I don't know of any specific examples of that in CBC, but I can just speak to the general principle that we should make sure that the board of directors reflects the people of the country.
We now have an online question from Howard Law, who asks, Mr. Singh, do you support or oppose, or does the NDP rather support or oppose the federal aid to media, to written journalism, or to the media in the last budget? There's been much talk about it. In fact, in my own newspaper, Le Devoir. What is the NDP position?
Thank you very much. I didn't catch your name, though. Howard, thank you so much for the question, Howard. So it is a complex thing. We absolutely support the fact that media needs support and needs some aid, and so we've been supportive of that announcement. We know that there's some concerns around this might be just a Band-Aid solution. We need a long-term solution, and that's really my concern, is that the idea of providing supports is important because we know that democracy needs a strong and vibrant media. But what I want to see is media getting the supports to be able to be on its own feet with the right policy decisions that are long-lasting. And that's why I've been really putting a lot of emphasis on the level playing field. The Canadian media reality is not a result of coincidence or just by chance. It's directly the result of decisions that governments have made. And Liberal and Conservative governments have made decisions that have benefited certain media, social media, the web giants, and that has been to the detriment of local traditional media. So I believe we can change that if we make the right choices, make the right decisions, and which is, let's end the tax loopholes, the disproportionately advantageous tax laws that help out web giants and hurt Canadian media, and then we can go to a position where media is vibrant, is supported. Let's make sure that media and journalists are compensated when they're reporting on news, and that news is then used. There should be a way to ensure that no web giant or tech giant can use information without compensating the journalist who put the time and effort into discovering that story or to writing that story. There's a lot that we can do that can create a more sustainable environment for Canadian journalism, and that is what I want to support. But yes, I do support the initiatives that were made to help Canadian media in the short term, but I would like to see a more long-term solution, and that's what I'm proposing.
And now for the results of our second poll question, which was, should the government apply the same laws and rules to internet media as companies like Facebook and Netflix, as their Canadian competitors? Not much of a surprise here. Yes, 96%. No, 4%. People agree with you, Mr. Singh. But let me move on to another question, this time from Paul in Toronto. What do you think of the Green Party's funding plans for CBC? Mr. Singh?
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, I can tell you that my commitments are the CBC is a public broadcaster, publicly funded, and it tells very important stories. And its journalism is of a high quality and something that Canadians need. So our position is we need to fund it. And so I've come forward with our commitment, which is to increase our per capita funding from $34 a year or per person per year to $50 per person per year. We know that this is still far lower than many other jurisdictions. I talked about BBC, for example, where the average is $100 per person per year. So we need to do a lot more to make sure our public broadcasting is funded. But then I also talked about how we can support Canadian media in general. I think there's so much that we can do. It really comes down to this question. So far, what we've seen from the governments in Ottawa, whether they're Liberal or Conservative, is that the question is, who are they working for? Well, they've been working for the people at the top. They've been working to help the web giants and the tech giants, and that's hurt Canadians. That's hurt Canadian democracy and Canadian journalism. I believe that we can have a government that works for you, that's in it for you, and that means making sure we support our vibrant democracy with strong journalism and level playing fields when it comes to laws and taxation, so that our Canadian media and journalism can thrive.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. A question from Brian in Inuvik. His question concerns the attacks on Google and Facebook. Brian, would you like to ask your question?
Okay. Hi, Jagmeet. I just finished going through a 600-page book by Mr. Senator Zupoff, and it's highly critical of Google and Facebook in ways that are not publicly common knowledge. And my question is, will the NDP regulate and attack Google and Facebook? That's it.
Mr. Singh.
Thanks so much for the question, Brian, and hope you're doing well in Inuvik. I absolutely agree with you. The criticisms, there's some real criticisms of what's happening with the web giants, and those criticisms speak to a couple of things. One is the fact that the web giants are a platform where they're being able to promote, or fake news is being able to be promoted. It's a platform where journalists are being disadvantaged because there's laws in our country right now in Canada that give a massive advantage to web giants, and that hurts Canadian content. And when you talked about making sure we've got some checks and balances, it's a very fair question, because right now Facebook is one of the biggest providers of news for most people. That's where they go to check the news, but they don't hire a single journalist. That's got to change. So what we want to put in place is, well, the other thing is that Facebook can allow fake news to be spread, or it can be a platform where fake news is being spread, but there's no remedy, there's no repercussion, there's nothing that happens if that information does indeed get shared. So what I'm proposing is we need to put in some checks and balances. We need to make sure that there are repercussions for fake news being spread, that there's a better way to bring down any sort of false information, any misinformation. There's a way to ensure that that gets removed quickly. We need to put better checks and balances in place when it comes to information, what's true, what's not, because it has very serious implications on our democracy. So thanks for raising the question, and I can tell you that this has been let happen because Liberals and Conservatives haven't had the courage to basically do something about it. And I want to say that it is something that I care about, and I can do something about it. And if you want to see this happen, then you need to have someone who's on your side that'll actually stand up for you, and that's what I'm going to do.
We're going to take one last question, but before we do, I want to remind everyone that you can leave a voice message for Jagmeet Singh once the call is complete. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, or if you didn't feel comfortable asking your question, just wait to the end of our telephone town hall and leave a message for NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh. Now, our last question for today from Sarah in Hope, BC. I think it's another question on Canadian content. Sarah, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I was wondering, you mentioned laws and protection of Canadian content, but what specific treaties and laws can enforce protection for copyright and content, Canadian content and copyright?
Thank you so much, Sarah. And if I'm not mistaken, Hope BC is a beautiful place on the way when you're traveling from Vancouver into the interior. And I had the honor of visiting your beautiful part of Canada. So it reminds me of a great trip that I had out there. With respect to your question on content, there's a couple of things we can do that's concrete. So the same way we've seen copyright laws apply to musicians, for example, online, that music can't be used unless there's clear compensation for the artist who created that music. Similarly, we can ensure that we have copyright rules that apply when a journalist writes a story and then a large web giant wants to share that story on their website or on their platform. We can make sure that we have laws in place that make sure that journalist gets compensated for the time and effort they put into writing that story. The other things that we can do, really clear things. Right now, the government of Canada, with Mr. Trudeau in charge, and before that with Mr. Harper, they've put in place laws that basically create an exemption that web giants don't have to pay taxes. And we could just simply change the rules and say, yes, they do have to pay taxes. We could just change the laws and make sure that they have to be held accountable. On top of that, we can just close the loopholes. The loopholes that mean if you're a company and you advertise through a web giant, you get an exemption to pay taxes. It's exempt. Instead, we could close that and say, no, you will have to pay the same rules apply whether you buy advertisement through a social media or a web giant platform or through a traditional platform. What we need to do is create a level playing field, and right now that doesn't exist. And because of that lack of level playing field, what we're seeing is effectively billions of dollars from our own public dollars being put into the pockets of these web giants, and that's hurting Canadian content. We are going to stop that.
In closing, Mr. Singh, perhaps I could ask you a final question. The digital revolution, what we call the fourth revolution, is probably affecting Canadian media, not just Canadian media the world over, and journalism the world over more than probably any other aspect. What do you think is the major problem concerning Canadian journalism today?
Well, it's really just there's been decisions that have been made, and these decisions are very clear by conservative and liberal governments. These are decisions that they made. It's a choice. And their choice was to give billions of dollars in subsidies to web giants, and that has directly meant it has detrimented Canadian journalism. And we're right now faced with the result of those decisions. And so the decisions have literally given billions of dollars to help one source of information, one source of content creation, and that has been to the detriment of Canadians. And so I believe that we will never solve this problem unless we get at the root cause, which are those policies that create that unlevel playing field. And that's why Canadian journalists have fallen behind. That's why Canadian media has been disadvantaged, and that's the result of why we've seen so many closures of media outlets, why we've seen so many jobs being lost in this market. 16,000 media jobs means a lot of people in Canada lost their jobs. They're not contributing back to the economy. They're not able to do their part, and that is directly a result of decisions that governments have made. And I want to change that. I'm confident we can change that. We've got great storytellers. We've got great journalists like yourself, Francine, who do a great job of representing the stories that matter to Canadians. We can do a better job of helping you out and letting you do your work if we had better laws in place, and that's what I want to do.
Thank you, merci, Monsieur Singh. That's it for our telephone town hall with NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your participation. Merci beaucoup à tous ceux et toutes celles qui ont participé cet après-midi. The next installment of the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting 2019 Leaders Series will take place next Saturday. Samedi prochain, la prochaine rencontre avec un chef de parti, Madame Elizabeth May, September 28th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Pacific. We will be talking to Green Party leader Elizabeth May for our next telephone town hall. If you haven't already, go to friends.ca and sign up for the mailing list so you will be notified of all the details by email. That's all for today. I'm Francine Pelletier. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for joining us. Et à la prochaine.